And when peace processes fail, the violence that comes afterwards is far more acute. And even when we have successes, the end of formal warfare is actually the beginning of a lot of violence in the home, as we heard, domestic violence, criminality, and so forth, because we're really not doing well enough in demobilizing, reintegrating fighters, and enabling society to get back on its feet and dealing with the psychosocial problems. Our attention span is limited. Our focus remains primarily on the spoilers, those who shout loudest and threaten most. And so we get the handful of terrorists or warlords and being the target of our attention and of our resources, and the vast majority of the population basically remaining invisible. And our reactions, our international reactions, are basically securitization, which is negatively affecting everyone. So regardless of the evidence or the logic, the international community seems to be unable to change tactics or adopt alternative approaches, ones that are more inclusive of the local population and supportive of women and men who, amidst the violence and attacks on their own communities, are preserving that slice of normalcy which we call peace, which is peace, who are willing to reach across the lines of conflict, to reconcile, to transform, to forgive, and to genuinely live. We keep ignoring that vast majority. So basically what we have is 21st century warfare, the types of wars and conflicts and violence that we have, internal conflict, transnational issues, and so forth, but being addressed through 20th century mechanisms and perspectives. We're still going at it as if it's interstate and we have to have our political leaders at the top and that's it. We go home and no, home is a safe space. It really isn't, because civil war, home is the same place for the two different sides. And we seem to conflate ending war, for which we need the war makers to basically cease fire, with bringing peace, which is a whole different set of issues. It's really about education and health and, as I say, the psychosocial side. We need the stakeholders that do peace to be involved. And the women I talked about are amongst those people. They're civilians, they're civil society. They have no exit strategy like America or the UK or any of the other international actors who go into places. They live with the consequences one way or the other. And yet they remain systematically excluded and invisible. My third point relating to that is that because changing business as usual, the way we've done business for the last 60 years, takes actual courage and vision, it's very easy for people who make these decisions to turn around when we say, hey look, why don't you work with the women? Why don't you look at what civil society is doing? Why don't you change the process to make it more inclusive of minority groups and other sectors of society, the business community, the religious sector, other actors who have a stake and an interest in making peace work? Why don't we change the way we do business? The response often is, well, can you really show to us that women are peaceful? Or they'll say something like, oh, but women can be violent as well. Yes, women are violent. Yes, we see women as being 30% to 40% maximum maybe of insurgent groups and armed groups. Absolutely. They're not the majority, and they don't represent the majority of women's activism. We have women politicians who can be just as hawkish as anyone next to them. We've had one in this country, and we certainly have one in the States. So it's not individuals, it's looking at the broader sector. Where is it that we see women really active? It's in civil society. They opt out of politics, but we need to engage them for where they are because they have a contribution to make. And this question of are women peaceful? I'll give you it's hard to have real life examples, but there's a very clear one from my own country of birth. If you take a country and you have 50% of the population that were second-class citizens, but had certain rights in a given political context. And you change the political situation, and that 50% has those rights that they had taken away from them. And for 30 years, they have pressure put on them. What would happen? In Sri Lanka, we saw it with the minority Tamil population, and after a while, they picked up arms. Everywhere we see where that division is based on ethnicity or religious identity, there has been an armed violent struggle that has emerged, whether it's after 10 years, or after 20 years, or after 30 years. In Iran, this happened on gender lines. Iranian women, in 1978 to 1979, had certain rights. It wasn't an equal society, it was a very patriarchal society, but they had certain rights and laws that enabled them to function effectively in society. These rights were suspended. And over the last 30 years, women have been at the forefront of the struggle for resistance and change in Iran. We've seen them, you've seen the images, I think, since June, the June elections. It has been a non-violent struggle. It has been using the unorthodox methods that women often do, whether it's through their clothing and their appearances, whether it's through their activism and their engagement, and whether it's their coming together. So the idea, so we have an example of a place where for 30 years women have been at the forefront of nonviolent resistance and change, and the impact that they have has had a ripple effect through society. And I think we should listen to that. Now, in terms of women in diplomacy, where we see them, when they come to the peace table, if they ever get a chance to be at the peace table, what is it that we see? In South Africa, we saw them having the capacity to show empathy for the enemy, having the capacity to trust and to listen and to build trust, which is such an important element of peace negotiations. And I remember talking to the former South African ambassador, I'm not sure what the formal title is, but the ambassador to the UK who had been involved. And she said these women came to the table and they brought with them the lessons of their domestic sphere. In their domestic environment, they had learned to listen to their children, to resolve the conflicts, to be patient with the elderly and the ones that they had to care for. They brought those skills to the political process, and it had a qualitative difference in terms of the atmosphere that was going on. I don't see this as a biological thing. We're not all geared to be great mothers at the beginning from the get-go. What I see it as is these are skills that we acquire, just as in the same way that we go to law school and we learn how to be a lawyer and we use those skills elsewhere. These women learned those skills on the job in their domestic sphere, and they brought them into the political sphere, and it had a big difference. I remember interviewing Mo Mola, and I said to her, what was it that made the difference? And she said I was a good listener. I was a good listener. It's interviewing 15 women who had been in formal peace processes around the world, the one thing that they kept talking about was the capacity to listen, the capacity to empathize, the capacity to build trust, and lower the levels of aggression. These things matter when we're trying to move a process forward through dialogue. Another thing that we often hear about women is that they bring forward the issues and concerns, the welfare of their community. So whereas there's a tendency to fight about the past, or as the Burundian woman said to me, the men sat at the table, and I'm sorry to stereotype, but this is what, when we talk to people who've been involved, these are the issues that come up. They're talking about the national pie and what position I'm going to get and what position you're going to get. The women, we're talking about what are we going to do for our communities? What do our children need? How do we deal with those that are sick and so forth? So that question of their circles of concern, the kinds of people that they are engaged with, which is their communities at large. In Somalia, we see there were 5 clans, and it was men led by men, and the women had no place in between. And there, a woman called Ashla Elmi decided that when she went to her father's house, she was treated as a spy because they thought that she came from her husband's side. And when she went to her husband's family, they thought that she was a spy from her father's clan. She led a humanitarian organization. She was invited to be an observer at a peace process and said, why can't we as women have a place? And they said, because only men represent the clans. So she formed the 6th clan, the women's clan, and became a signatory to the peace process. And over the years in Somalia, the women stood in the streets of Mogadishu and collected weapons. So this takes immense courage, and we don't recognize it, we don't support it, we don't build up on it. The irony in all of this is that all this work and talk about women has also led us, because women talk about it, has also led us to the condition and situation of men in these societies. In Liberia, there's 85% unemployment. In Jamaica, we're seeing huge amounts of young boys dropping out of school and getting involved in gang violence. In Kenya, it's the same thing. Wherever in the Middle East, there's a different factor that's going on. Wherever we look, it is our young men that are getting involved in violence, getting wrapped up in violence and being affected by violence. And it's women who are talking about it and saying, we need to do something about this. And the issue, the irony in all of this, again, for me, is that the term gender is often used, and we equate gender with women, but gender is really about our social roles and identities. And when you look at what is happening in most of the countries around the world where violence is on the up, whether it's informal insurgencies or gang warfare, the perpetrators are recruiting our young men on the basis of their social gender identities. They're identifying that these are boys who have a lack of self-esteem, that want to have a sense of belonging, that want to be cool, that want to feel as if they're doing something above and beyond just having an ordinary job, and have a social justice element. They recruit them on that basis. And yet we fail to recognize that these gender and social roles of women and men are integral to our understanding and the responses that we need for addressing the questions of violence and terrorism that we have. So that's just a snippet on the third question. Now, to the question of my fourth point, of what is it that we can do? I work in Washington, and as the message there is always, tell us what we have to do. You know, forget about the analysis. What's the action? So I'm bringing a little bit of that here. We heard earlier that at the Security Council at the UN in the year 2000, Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security was passed. I was involved in mobilizing civil society around that, and it was a resolution that came from women in conflict areas wanting to be recognized by the global structures and policy framework.